Right, hi there, it's David Taylor again, alias Mr. Pelargonium on the Pelargonium and Geranium Society channel here on YouTube. Today I'm going to do a relatively short talk about feeding Pelargoniums and feeding plants in general. Actually, a lot of this will apply to, because I've had a lot of messages this week about how you go about feeding your plants. In particular, obviously, we're talking about Pelargoniums and what they like in particular. So I'm going to run through some of the things and some of the methods that I use to feed my plants. But certainly during the main growing period, which we're in now, they need to be given a good dose of feed to keep them growing very strongly throughout the season. Now, obviously, that type of feed varies depending on what you're trying to achieve with your plants. If you want them perhaps to put on a bit more bloom, if you want them to put on a bit more growth, it all just slightly alters what you're going to feed them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Right, now in general terms, plant feed comes with three major constituents. The first one being nitrogen, which is often classified with the letter N. The second one, I've got to get this round, so I always get them round the wrong way. The second one is phosphorus, which is always listed with the letter P. And then the third one is potassium or potash. And I know they are both P's as well together, but they are actually given the letter K because there'd be too many P's in the makeup of them. So they list that as a K. So they're the three main constituents of plant feed, whether that be granular that you may spread, say on soil, or that's made up in a liquid feed type that will be given to your roots of your plants. Generally, nitrogen itself is all to do with growth. Is to do with leaf growth and stem growth. This is all. I mean, they do sort of slightly overlap in various issues, but in general terms, the leaf development, leaf growth, and the stem growth, soft stem growth, is all to do with nitrogen. In terms of phosphorus, that is all to do with what's going on below the soil level, so the roots. And a certain amount of the development and strength of the plant as well is the phosphorus, and that is good for roots and generally sort of provides a bit of maturity to the plant's strength as well. And then in terms of the potassium or the potash, that is all to do with strength of the plant in terms of being able to be a firm plant, hold up its strength and stems, develop a bit of strength, develop a bit of woody stem, and be able to push out the maturity in growing into a mature plant and pushing out all of those flowers and really developing bud set and ultimately seed development and seed set. Now, on top of that, they usually add a lot of other sort of micronutrients as well. Now, micronutrients can be very important. And if I just go and grab a plant here, now this plant generally looks quite healthy. In actual fact, it's quite pale, and the reason is I've grown these plants. These plants have been in these pots now for probably over a year, and they're very pot bound. And the idea is that I want them pot bound in order to throw a lot of bloom, because that can often help. But you'll see this plant is actually relatively pale and the veins are very, very obvious and standing out really against the basic green. It's generally healthy, there's nothing too much wrong with it. But what happens when a plant gets really pot bound, it can sometimes not really absorb as much feed as it should be. And particularly during the spring, I've only really got going with feed probably in the last month or two. And I was only giving them a feed really sort of once in 3 waterings during the early part of the spring, mainly because it was quite cold here in the UK. But what that's done, it's led to we got a very pale green body of the leaves. And now I can remedy that by adding magnesium sulfate, or what's commonly known as Epsom Salts. I think it was created in the county town of Epsom in Surrey in the UK. What we can basically do, we can add a teaspoonful per gallon to any feed mixture that I'm making up, and it will make that plant become a much darker colour and much more, if you like, healthy looking. But I know it doesn't look too bad, the shape and everything is there. I could probably do with a bit more progressive bloom, but that's a whole other scenario entirely. Now, the constitutional makeup of using these three main elements that I spoke about just earlier is usually done in a numbering system. If you look on the back of any pack of feed, it'll say proportionally what the breakdown of the three major elements of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium or potash. It will break down what those three will be. And this number can really be anything. It's all to do with proportions. So, I mean, a typical balanced feed is going to have equal amounts of the three main constituents. A high potash feed will generally have a higher potash element, so a higher number of the three. The K number will be slightly higher. Now, a high nitrogen, you may use perhaps early in the season if you really want to push on some strong stem growth and get some bigger leaves going. You may want to really push out and use a high nitrogen feed. So that would be a higher number at the beginning, as opposed, say, a 2-1-1 proportion. So for balance, we have a sort of equal numbers. It can be any number. I think it generally sort of determines on the manufacturer. But 1-1-1 would be the same as, say, 20-20-20. So, you know, it is no different really. 1-1-2 or a high potash element, you know, could be measured in, say, 10-10-25 or, you know, 10-10-20. I mean, there's various elements. Obviously, there's going to be different proportional elements. And a high nitrogen could be, say, 10-5-5 or, you know, proportions thereabout, higher or lower. As a general term, I use a balanced feed because in most of the year, I want equal growth of the leaf and stem elements, the roots, and perhaps slightly less, but I do want them to be thinking about producing flower at the end of the day. What I often use now, particularly at this time of year, a month before the show, I'm starting to use a high potash feed because I want them to really think about throwing a lot of dense bloom and a lot of strong growth. So that is what a high potash feed is going to do. Often at this time of year, you're going to see a lot of tomato type feeds, and they're generally high potash feeds or a higher number at the end. And they're ideal for what I want to use. You can use them, you know, just follow the manufacturer's instructions. One that I use in the UK, there's a popular one called Tomerite, which is fine for what I'm using now. I may intermix it. There's nothing wrong with mixing up different sort of types of feed. So I may use Tomerite 1 week, and then the next week I'll go back to a balanced feed. Now, in terms of a balanced feed, I use a wholesale supply feed because I buy it in bulk. So I generally go about 2/3 strength at every watering. So it's really promoting growth, really promoting flowering with using something like Tomerite. Now, with regard to, say, a newly potted plant, and I've got a few about here, in general terms, here's a unique type plant here. This was only potted a month ago, less than a month ago actually. And what you'll often find is compost that you buy that you're going to use. I mix up mine much as I did in one of my previous 2015 videos. I'll perhaps do another one about compost, but you can look at the sort of constituent elements I use for my compost mix. But the compost that you use is going to have some of this feed in it. So I never use feed on a freshly potted plant until about 6 to 7 weeks after it's been potted. I will only use water up until that point because it doesn't need any feed, because the new compost is going to have lots of feed embedded in it. And you can often add a bit of feed to your compost mix if you wish. I don't do that personally, but I know a lot of growers that do. They add a specific feed. You can get long-acting feed as well, which means that you don't perhaps need to liquid feed as much. But I prefer, as an exhibition grower, to use a liquid feed so that I know exactly what they're getting and what I'm trying to promote. Now, with regards to the plants at the moment, I've got about 4 or 5 different sort of mixtures going around the greenhouse at the moment in different watering cans. So I'm using a high potash feed for plants that I do not want to get any bigger, but I want to get the bloom activated on them. So I'm using a high potash feed for those. Plants that I wouldn't mind getting a little bit bigger, as well as promoting a bit of bloom, I'm using a balanced feed on. So they're getting a balanced mixture. Some are getting some that I may want a little bit of growth, but I also want to really pump the bloom. I'm actually just got a small watering can and I'll mix a little bit of the two, the high potash and the balance together to almost make a hybrid feed, sort of halfway house. So I'm using those. I'm using that mixture for some of the other plants. But with regard, I mean, the problem is with other countries is that I really can't sort of dictate what may be available in some of the other countries, because I've had emails from lots of people in the sort of Mediterranean areas and other parts of Central Europe, and I really can't sort of report into what type of feed you may be able to buy in those countries. But as long as you follow the elements, I'm sure all feed suppliers will still have the numbering system on there somewhere. So if you follow the numbering system, the first number will always be the nitrogen, the second number will always be the phosphorus, and the third number will always be the potassium or the potash. So that's generally what you want to look at. And if you're trying to develop bloom, you want a higher number at the end. If you're trying to develop growth, you want a higher number at the beginning. If you just want something that's going to keep your plants generally rounded and growing sort of fully healthily, particularly during, say, the cooler times, use one where the numbers are all the same. So you've got a balanced type feed. So I hope you've enjoyed that, a little bit of advice, and I hope I've been able to outline feed, particularly for those that have contacted me this week about feeding. So thanks for now, and I'll see you again soon.